There's a moment that happens quietly, usually in the middle of a conversation, when you realize you're not trying to be understood. You're just listening, not in the polite way people listen while waiting for their turn to speak, not in the strategic way people listen so they can respond well, but in a way that feels detached from outcome. You're not trying to impress. You're not trying to convince. You're not trying to be seen a certain way. And that absence of effort is noticeable. People feel it, even if they can't explain it. They may mistake it for confidence or arrogance or emotional distance. But it's none of those. It's something quieter, something that didn't come from winning arguments or proving value. It came from reaching a point where proving stopped making sense. There was a time when you did try, when you explained yourself carefully, when you clarified your intentions, when you over-communicated so you wouldn't be misunderstood. You remember the tension in those moments, the way your chest tightened when you felt someone misread you, the urgency to correct the narrative, the discomfort of being seen inaccurately. But over time, something shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, gradually. You noticed that explanations didn't always lead to understanding, that clarity didn't guarantee safety, that proving your truth didn't always protect. So you stopped, not out of bitterness, out of recognition. You realized that some people don't misunderstand you because you're unclear. They misunderstand you because they're listening through their own needs. And no amount of explanation changes that. This is where the discomfort begins. Because the world rewards performance. It rewards those who assert, justify, defend, and declare. It rewards visibility. And yet here you are, increasingly uninterested in performing yourself into acceptance. You don't announce your strength. You don't highlight your resilience. You don't list what you've endured. You don't need to. Not because it didn't happen, but because carrying it already taught you something deeper than validation ever could. You've noticed how often people need to prove themselves, how much energy goes into being perceived correctly, how much effort goes into shaping identity in the eyes of others. And instead of feeling superior, you feel tired because you remember what it felt like to live there, to feel like being misunderstood was dangerous, to believe that being unseen meant being erased. And something inside you no longer reacts the same way. When someone doubts you, your body stays still. When someone underestimates you, you don't rush to correct them. When someone projects onto you, you don't scramble to dismantle the projection. This unnerves people because they expect defense. They expect explanation. They expect a response. And when it doesn't come, they assume confidence. But confidence is loud. This is quiet. This is grounded in something less visible. You've learned that the need to prove is rooted in instability, not weakness, instability. When your sense of self depends on external agreement, every interaction becomes a negotiation. Every misunderstanding becomes a threat. Every silence becomes a verdict. You don't live there anymore, not because you've mastered detachment, but because you've experienced something that made proving feel irrelevant. There's an internal stillness that came from surviving things that didn't care how well you explained yourself. Moments where clarity didn't save you, where truth didn't protect you, where being right didn't change the outcome. That teaches a person something no book can. It teaches you that power doesn't always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like non-engagement. You don't correct every false assumption. You don't chase every misunderstanding. You don't defend yourself against every judgment. And the reason isn't indifference, it's discernment. You know how much energy it costs to stay emotionally activated. You know how draining it is to live in reaction. So you choose stillness. But stillness isn't passive. It's selective. You choose when something deserves your voice, and more often than not, you realize it doesn't. This is where people get confused. They expect strength to look assertive. They expect power to announce itself. They expect confidence to demand recognition. But what they don't understand is that real internal power doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need agreement. It doesn't even need to be seen. You've noticed how the less you explain yourself, the clearer your presence becomes. How the less you try to control perception, the more grounded you feel. How silence, when chosen rather than enforced, carries weight. This wasn't always true for you. There was a time when silence felt like danger, when not explaining yourself felt like surrender, when being misunderstood felt unbearable. But that was before you learned something crucial, before you realized that understanding is not something you can force. It either happens or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, no amount of effort can manufacture it. So you stopped trying to manage how others see you. And something strange happened. Your energy shifted. People leaned in without you asking. They sensed depth without you describing it. They felt something steady without you naming it. This is the paradox. The less you try to prove, the more weight your presence carries, because proving comes from insecurity. And insecurity leaks, even when masked as confidence. What you carry now doesn't leak, it sits quietly. And that quiet unsettles people who are still negotiating their worth. They may test you, provoke you, question you, not because they want clarity, but because they want reaction. And when it doesn't come, they feel exposed, because your stillness reflects something they're not ready to face, that they are still trying to convince the world of who they are, while you've stopped asking the world for permission to exist as you are. But this didn't come from self-help. It didn't come from affirmations. It came from exhaustion, from reaching a point where explaining yourself felt more damaging than being misunderstood, from realizing that your truth doesn't require consensus. And that realization marks a psychological shift most people never make, because it requires letting go of control over perception, control over narrative, control over being liked. And letting go of control feels terrifying until you realize how much of your life was spent managing it. What you've stepped into now is not apathy. It's internal authority, authority that doesn't argue, authority that doesn't compete, authority that doesn't chase recognition. And that authority didn't appear because you decided to be powerful. It appeared because you stopped outsourcing your sense of self. But here's the part that matters most. This stillness didn't make your life easier. It made it quieter, and quiet is confronting, because without constant external validation, you're left alone with yourself. And that's where the real transformation happened, not when you stop proving, but when you realize you didn't need to. We're not at the core yet, but we're getting closer. Because the reason you don't need to prove anything is far more unsettling than confidence, and far deeper than strength. That comes next. At some point, you realize something that feels almost uncomfortable to admit. You didn't stop proving yourself because you became confident. You stopped because you learned something deeper. You learned that proving yourself keeps you emotionally available to people who have no intention of meeting you. Every explanation you gave was an invitation. Every defense was an opening. Every clarification handed someone access to your inner world. And too often, that access was mishandled, so your system adapted again, not by hardening, not by closing, by conserving. You began to notice how much emotional energy proving requires. The constant recalibration, the mental rehearsals, the subtle anxiety of wondering whether you were understood correctly. And one day, without ceremony, you realized something startling. Your life felt calmer when you let people misunderstand you, not because misunderstanding felt good, but because the effort to prevent it felt worse. That's when the real shift happened. You stopped participating in emotional negotiations. You stopped trying to preempt reactions. You stopped shaping yourself into something more digestible, and the world reacted. Some people pulled away, some grew uneasy, some became more critical, because when you no longer seek validation, you disrupt an unspoken contract. The contract where worth is earned through explanation, through performance, through compliance. By stepping out of that contract, you became unpredictable. And unpredictability unsettles people who rely on control. Here's the part most don't understand. Your silence is not absence. It's presence without permission seeking. When you speak now, it's not to be understood. It's to be accurate. And accuracy doesn't require consensus. This is why arguments stopped appealing to you. Not because you always agree, but because disagreement no longer threatens your identity. You don't need to win to exist. You don't need to be right to be whole. You don't need acknowledgement to remain grounded. That's not detachment. That's internal anchoring. And internal anchoring changes everything. You begin to notice how many conversations are really about hierarchy. Who knows more? Who feels more? Who is more justified? You step out of those dynamics naturally, not as rebellion, as irrelevance. Because once your sense of self is internally stabilized, comparison loses its grip. You're no longer scanning rooms to see where you stand. You're no longer adjusting yourself to be received well. You're no longer interpreting silence as rejection. And this is where the word power becomes misleading, because what you embody doesn't feel powerful. It feels neutral, still, unmoved. You don't dominate rooms. You don't demand attention. You don't assert presence. Your presence just stays, unshaken by approval or disapproval. And people feel that. They may not admire it. They may not like it, but they sense it because it exposes something in them that they are still negotiating, still proving, still chasing alignment from the outside in. Your refusal to do that becomes a mirror. And mirrors make people uncomfortable, especially when they reflect insecurities someone hasn't named yet. Here's the most unsettling truth. You didn't become this way because life treated you gently. You became this way because you learned that external validation is unreliable, that explanations can be weaponized, that being fully seen by the wrong people is more dangerous than being misunderstood by many. So you stopped offering yourself to every gaze. You stopped narrating your inner world. You stopped giving people the tools to define you. That doesn't mean you don't connect. It means connection is no longer cheap, no longer automatic, no longer available to anyone who asks. And that selectivity is not arrogance. It's earned restraint, the kind that forms when someone has been emotionally overexposed before. When they've learned through experience that access should be intentional. And this brings us to the core insight. The powerful empath doesn't need to prove anything because they no longer confuse visibility with safety. They no longer believe being understood by everyone is necessary for peace. They no longer hand their emotional center to the room. They keep it quietly, which means misunderstandings no longer destabilize them. Criticism no longer dismantles them. Doubt no longer chases them, not because those things stopped happening, but because their sense of self is no longer up for negotiation. This doesn't make life easier. It makes it clearer. You lose people who needed you to explain yourself. You lose dynamics that depended on your emotional labor. You lose the illusion of control over perception. But what you gain is something rare, internal sovereignty. The ability to remain yourself regardless of audience. The ability to exist without defending your existence. The ability to let silence speak without fear of erasure. And here's the final truth that lingers. The moment you stop proving yourself is the moment you accept that some people will never see you clearly. And that's not a failure. It's a boundary that doesn't need announcing. You don't correct the record anymore. You don't rewrite the narrative. You let it stand because you know who you are. And that knowing doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need agreement. It doesn't even need to be shared. It just needs to be held. And once it is, everything else grows quiet. Not empty, but resolved. That's why you don't prove anything. Not because you're above it, but because you've already lived without safety. And you learn that the only proof that matters is the one you no longer feel compelled to give.